What is good, my people? Welcome to Wally's Welding World. I'm the Weld Professor. Today we're going to go ahead and go over the repad that I've been talking about installing on the pipe. Step 1. Understand the ISO. From the center of the long radius 90 to the center of the long neck flange with the repad is your very first step. You need to understand exactly where you're going to lay it out so that way you don't screw it up. So check it out. Here we go. This is the repad, and this is the cold service repad, in fact, and this is the long neck flange that I have. So let's go ahead and move over right to step 2 so that way you understand kind of what it looks like. You need to make the pipe completely level and plumb and lay it out from the long radius 90 to the center of that. Step 3 is pretty much putting the levels on there and making sure that everything is correct. That way you don't mess it up. You don't want to install it to a crooked piece of pipe. Step 4, lay your center punch on the top of the pipe and get it adjusted right so that way you don't mess it up. You don't want to screw this part up at all. Let's help the helper out a little and give him some motivation. Step 5, make sure that it doesn't rock and that it's completely set on there perfect before you punch it. And then you can move on to step 6, and that's lay it out so that way you know exactly how long it's going to be of the hole, or basically how wide of a hole. You want to give yourself a little bit of room on each side so that way you can go ahead and get a good full penetration on each of it. This is kind of just a rough draft of getting the circle established so that way we can go ahead and remove the paint. Well, when I say we, I mean the helper. Step 8, let him buff it off and get it completely clean so that way when I go back and lay it out again, the paint doesn't mess me up. So I'm kind of teaching him how to go over it. Step 9, lay it out on the pipe that doesn't have any paint. Step 10, verify your measurement to make sure that it's correct. You don't want to cut the hole too small or too big. This is step 11. Give it about an 1/8 inch on each side and punch it. So that way when you go ahead and lay it out on the sides, step 12, that it's a little bit wider. On basically a contoured radius like this, it's not going to be a straight cut, so you're going to have to open up a little bit wider on the sides. Pay attention. See how it is? It's not wider on the top, it's wider on the sides. Step 13. Turn your bottles on. Don't want to hook your torch up and have no oxygen or acetylene. It's just kind of a joke, but we're going to go ahead and throw it in there on the steps. Okay? Step 14. Light your torch and set it so that way you can go ahead and start cutting. Alright, now let's move over to step 15. Start your cut, but start on the inside of the hole, never on the outside of the hole. Burn yourself a little bit of hole away from where you're going to be cutting, and then drag the torch to the line and start cutting on the line. Now you'll notice every time I switch positions, I would kind of cut into the circle. Never want to cut to the outside of the circle because you need the circle to be the best it can possibly be. If you go outside the circle, you might end up cutting it too wide, and you don't want to do that. Step 16. Once you have already established the cut, go ahead and remove that center cut. Moving right along here, it's not the best cut, but it's a good cut to start with. And we'll move to step 17. And that's go ahead and place your long neck flange on there with the pipe that's pretty much connected to the flange and see if you could get a good fit. You notice my fit isn't the best, so I'm going to have to open it up just a little bit. I had to remove my guard because I was not able to get the angle I needed to with my disc. Step 18. Make sure to put a bevel with a knife edge all the way around it so that way you can get a good, full penetration with the rod when you try to stick it down in there. Kind of just overlooking my circle to see the bevel here to make sure this is what it looks like. You want to make sure you can get down in there and get that weld. I kind of move over to step 19 and take a cone stone to it and flatten it out just a little bit to make that edge really sharp and really flat. You don't really want it to be round, you want it to be really straight like a bevel. Step 20. Fit your pipe in the pipe to make sure that it's going to fit. And then after you do that, you want to go ahead and establish a landing on the knife edge. So take your round disc or your grinding disc and get yourself a little bit of landing all the way you can around that pipe to make sure that you do have a landing. And again, don't make your landing too big because then you'll have to thin out your bevel again and you won't be able to get the penetration you're trying to accomplish. So make sure that you have another nice little landing on there. That way you can go ahead and make your weld. Remember to keep it nice and small. Don't want it too big because you'll have to re-bevel it, and you want it to be a perfect size. Step 22 is kind of just verifying it, making sure it's correct. Now, after you establish the landing, take some band wire and pull up your repad and tie it off. So that way you can do this and make sure that you can get your good gap and height and level on your fitting. You don't have to follow all these steps, but these are just kind of guidelines of steps on how to take it and how to approach it. If you have a better method, by any means, feel free to share it in the comments. Now I need to two-hole the flange to the pipe, so I run my straight edge across the top of the holes on the far inside and look down my straight edge on the pipe. Once it's lined up with the two holes, I can look down it and see that it's lined against the pipe perfectly, which will accomplish a perfect two-hole. Got to make sure that pipe is two-hole sitting on top of the pipe. And again, check your levels to make sure it stays level before you tack it. Your next step up will be tacking it in two places, on one side and then the opposite side. I recommend tacking it on the lowest ends and then tacking it onto the next ends. Again, you need to be making sure it's level at all times. And these steps are just guidelines to give you steps for an example. I would prefer to grind my tacks on each side so that way when I'm running my bead in there, I know that I'm going to be accomplishing full penetration on them. And I just think it's the best to do. That way you're not having a weak point where you did not tie in. You want to make sure you're getting tied in. I'll go ahead and move over to step 29, which will basically be welding out each quarter of it. You want to weld on each quarter separately, not on one side. That will help you with the pull of when you're sinking it down on there. And again, it's just me welding, so that's all this really is. You basically weld it out in 4 sections. One corner, the opposite corner, and then each other corner, which is divided in 4 passes, which usually takes about a full rod on each quarter. Notice how my repad can slide? That's something you want to do so when you reach down in there, it's not getting in your way. Step 30, grind the bead out. Once you have the bead grinded not completely out, but down, you go ahead and move over to step 31 and start at the lowest point of the pipe and weld up, because we are using low-high now from here on out. I start with a 1/8 70/18, and I do the same. I weld it out in quarters. I weld from the bottom up here, and then I'll jump over to the other side, weld it from the bottom up, and then jump back over to this side and grind out my start to make sure it's good and not dirty, because you don't want to be trapping slag, and you definitely don't want to be putting porosity into this part of the weld at all. Once I get done welding, I like to look inside with a flashlight and verify I do have a bead all the way around the pipe. They did not want me to contour this piece, they just wanted me to stub the pipe in there and then weld it. Most times they'll make you cut that radius off of the pipe so you have basically a clean saddle on the inside. But at this point, it's not necessary, so that's why it's not done and accomplished. Now that I have this part welded out, I will buff it off and continue with the next size rod, which is a 532 70/18. Make sure my tie-ins are good and make sure that it looks appropriate all the way around, no porosity. Undercut at this point is not really that crucial of a thing, because I will be basically adding more filler metal to cover up the bevel all the way. Notice how I have the repad position like this, that way it doesn't get in my way and I don't arc out on it. Start at the bottom of the pipe and work your way up. Don't ever weld downhill with 70/18. If you're welding downhill, it should be either a 70/10 or an 80/10. And then this process is a cold process, so we don't weld 70/10 or 80/10 on it. We only weld 70/18. Notice now that I have it welded out fairly much, but it's still not complete. I still need to be able to flush it out even more. See, there was a little bit of trap slag there, so I'm going to go ahead and take my time and grind out the little bit of slag that I had right there. That's not an arc mark, if you're wondering. That's just a BB rolling across the pipe and burning it. But I now grinded it out to make sure that there's no slag trapment in there. And now I'm finishing it with my final quarter passes, because I do that all the way out, and I'm filling it up. That's with a 532 70/18. Right here I go over the amperage, 169 amps on uphill mode on my Miller 400. 532 is the low high I was using. Step 32 is just verifying it to make sure you see nothing that is going to cause it to have porosity or crack. And then I move over to step 33, and that's grind it out completely flush with the pipe. There is a little bit of undercut on the top, but I'm not worried about it because I will be laying the repad down on it now and welding it out completely in the throat of the repad to make sure that I fill it all up. See? Then I'll move over to step 34, remove the repad again and clear all the paint out from underneath it. It's very important that you get all the paint out from under it. Now that I have that accomplished, I take some come-alongs because the repad did not fit on there properly. This point now, it does fit on there properly, and I have it sunk all the way down, so that way now I can finish my process of welding the repad on. Make sure that there's no gap in between the pipe and the repad. Make sure the repad is center on the pipe. That way you can accomplish full penetration around the top of that repad. I then like to tack it in 4 spots, on the bottom of the repads and on the top of the repad, before I start that weld process. Sometimes I'll buff it off and go ahead and weld all the way around the repad, that way I know it's not going to break my tacks and come off of it. And I guess we can call that step 37. I still weld it out in quarters from one side to the opposite side and then back over again from one side to the opposite side. Not that it's gonna matter, but for me that's just a pattern I like to use. Now that I got it welded all the way around the outside, I start my weld on the inside. And I usually start with a 1/8 70/18 and then I'll move it up to a 532 70/18 rod. Again, I start from the bottom of the pipe and work my way to the top of the pipe because this is 70/18 and you have to weld it uphill. I always like to verify my weld afterward to make sure I'm not trapping slag or leaving porosity, because if you do at that point, you're going to need to grind it out. Was trying to zoom in on this because it did look like it might have been porosity or undercut, but it wasn't. At this point, I have it flush enough to where I can go ahead and start to cap on the inside. So I still take my 532 and I run passes all the way around it to fill this up. Right now I'm starting the bottom pass of my cap up here, so I start on the bottom edge of the repad and then I work my way up towards the pipe. It's important to go up and stacking your beads rather than down stacking your beads. And again, I start from the lowest end of the pipe and I work my way to the top of the pipe in quarters. For me, this just helps me in my mind tell me that it's not going to be pulling my flange one way or the other. You want to make sure that it stays level on both sides at the top of that flange there. Now I move on to my second pass and I stack it on top of the bottom pass, still running quarters, vice versa from one side to the next side. It's always not the prettiest, but I try to do my best. You can see where I stopped here and where I started. I started from the lowest end of the pipe and I worked my way to the top of the pipe. Right here I had a little bit of porosity on my very top pass, so I had to grind it out. I don't need any kind of chance of failing the test that they'll be doing it next, which is a die pin test. When they do the die pin test, they're basically checking for any kind of porosity that you left behind. If you have undercut or porosity, it will show in the die pin test. Notice my weep hole there? That is basically a cheat hole to tell them if my weld underneath fails and has either a crack or porosity holes leading it to leak. Now that I have welded out the top, it's time to weld out the bottom. So I will start on the bottom of the bead I've already put on there, and I'll start stacking it up just like I did on the top. And again, I work from the bottom and then I work my way up. I was able to save my rod there, so I'm able to strike it up. Notice how I strike the rod up and then drag it down. That way I'm not trapping porosity and I'm burning it out on my way up. To me, the weld's never good enough. It always needs more improvement, but I do my best. You can see I'm working my way up around the pipe now, and I'm stacking my beads on top of each other. Now I'm approaching the top edge of my repad. It's very hard not to undercut it unless you run it a very cold heat, and cold heat will usually cause it to hump up. I don't like to run it too cold because then I'm usually having to grind it out and redo it on the appearance of it. I took a cutoff disc and I tried to give myself a nice edge around the top of it. That way I could stack 3 passes across it and not have to put 4 passes on the top of it. Here's the 3 passes around the top. You could see that I cut it really hard, and I did not like it. So I had to break out the grinder and grind along the top of it to give me a nice little landing area to lay my next pass. And again, I had to put 4 passes on this, not 3. I wasn't able to accomplish what I wanted. So I went and go ahead and just run a grinding disc through the top of it there to give me a nice little landing. Step 39, weld it back up. It wasn't the greatest, but it's going to work at this point now. I was able to get rid of most of the undercut, but not all of it. It actually looked worse than it was. The last step is to put on the reinforcement bars, which is just kind of silly, but they want them on there because they're afraid if they put a valve on the top of it, it could bend the flange one way or the other. If you like the video, comment you like it. Maybe comment what you don't like about it. Share it with your friends, but definitely subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll wrap to you later. I'm out. Peace.